Can some of the greatest bands and artists in the history of rock and roll actually have albums that are overlooked or underrated? They absolutely can, and that's what we're talking about today on For People Who Love Music. Yes, this video is for people who love music, and that's you, and that's me. And I'm Richard Maddow, and I'm your host for this video. So let's talk about this for a second. You know, there are so many bands and artists who are incredibly highly regarded by just about everybody. You know, people like The Who, Bob Dylan, Elvis Costello, the Beatles. Most people love these bands and artists, but I think we also get accustomed to listening to their classics, their most highly regarded works. And that many times leaves out these albums that kind of slip under the radar. And that's a shame. And that's what we're talking about today. So let's start with one of the great bands of all time, The Who. And the album that I think is really underrated by The Who is The Who by Numbers. I mean, geez, coming off of Tommy, then Who's Next, then Quadrophenia. These are some of the most important works in the history of rock and roll, albums that we all know and we all love. And Pete Townshend found himself in a little bit of a funk. He was, I think, drinking too much, taking too many drugs, kind of in a depression. And he said he just sat down and cried his eyes out and wrote the songs for The Who by Numbers. So they are very personal in nature. They're not big and bombastic like Quadrophenia and Who's Next. A lot of them use acoustic guitars. Pete actually sings on many of them instead of Roger Daltrey. So great album. It plays through from start to finish. It's incredible. Highlight tracks for me are Slip Kid, Dreaming from the Waist, and the just sublime Blue, Red, and Gray, a really touching song that Pete does on ukulele. So check out The Who by Numbers. Okay, let's move to Paul McCartney. While he had so many great post-Beatles albums, of course, the original DIY album just called McCartney. It's got Ram, Band on the Run, Venus and Mars, and then even later on, Chaos and Creation in the Backyard, Egypt Station, just great, great, great stuff. My favorite and maybe underrated album by Paul McCartney, underrated album is Red Rose Speedway. Kind of fell in there where he was, I don't know, being maybe a little dissed because people said he was writing silly love songs. And it does have the sappy song on it, My Love, but geez, it's got some great stuff. Big Barn Red, the opener, is just awesome, just makes you smile. Single Pigeon, Little Lamb Dragonfly, absolute classic. And my favorite on the whole album is the 4-song medley that closes out side 2. Just typical McCartney genius, little hummable melodies. He intertwines them in a way that only McCartney can. Definitely check out Red Rose Speedway. Okay, let's move on to the Doobie Brothers. And man, do I love me some Doobies. There are times when only the Doobie Brothers will do, especially their second, third, and fourth albums, Toulouse Street, The Captain and Me, What Were Once Vices Are Now Habits. While this is, in my opinion, Doobie Brothers at their finest, pristine recordings, beautifully produced, incredible sound, great songs, the vocals, the guitar work, just top notch. I'm not a big fan of the Michael McDonald era Doobie Brothers. If you are, no problem. But the album I want to mention today is Stampede, which is kind of the last album with the classic Doobies lineup. It starts off with a swampy, funky song called Sweet Maxine. If you listen to it, you might think it's a Little Feat song. And much of that is because the great keyboardist Bill Payne from Little Feat plays on that song and plays on much of the album. We've got Neil's Fandango, Rainy Day Crossroad Blues, an incredible instrumental called Slatke Sokol Rag, which really shows what fantastic musicians the Doobies are. And then my favorite song on the album, I Cheat the Hangman, just a haunting Pat Simmons song with that build-up instrumental ending. It will give you the shivers. Okay, Billy Joel, he really broke it through with The Stranger. That was a huge album that everybody purchased. In my college days at University of Maryland, that was the album that was blasting out of every single dorm room. Well, that and The Dead and Springsteen, and of course, many other great albums. But that's the album that really broke it open for Billy Joel, The Stranger. Before that, he had some great stuff too, with Turnstiles, Piano Man, Street Love Serenader. And then after that, he had some really highly regarded albums, 52nd Street, Glass Houses. But my favorite overlooked Billy Joel album is The Nylon Curtain. It's a little bit later in his career, and maybe people were tiring of Billy Joel, I don't know. But Allentown, Laura, Pressure, which is the song that just gets to me every time. And then my two favorites, both very haunting songs in their own ways. Goodnight Saigon and Scandinavian Skies, which is very Lennon-esque. Nylon Curtain by Billy Joel. Okay, let's move on to another band that's so highly regarded, and that is Fleetwood Mac. Now, Fleetwood Mac kind of broke it open in the US. That's when they added Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks to their lineup. Before that, they were a band that got some FM radio play. If you were really into some good, deep stuff, you probably knew some Fleetwood Mac tracks, but I don't think they were that well known and that well loved in the US. And then, of course, after the Fleetwood Mac album came Rumors, and boy, end of story. Everybody knows Fleetwood Mac. Everybody loves Fleetwood Mac. I mean, that's one of the greatest albums of all time. But before that, before Stevie and Lindsey joined the band, they had a bunch of good albums. I think one of their problems was these albums were kind of inconsistent. They didn't go strong from start to finish. My favorite of the bunch, and an album that I think is really underrated, is Bare Trees. They had the guitar lineup of Danny Kerwin and Bob Welch, and they each had their own style. Some great songs, Child of Mine, Homeward Bound, the title cut Bare Trees. Two incredible Christine McVie classics are Sentimental Lady, Spare Me a Little of Your Love, a great instrumental there with Sunny Side of Heaven, Bare Trees by Fleetwood Mac, definitely worth your time. Okay, we all know Paul Simon is one of the great American songwriters. After Simon and Garfunkel split, he had his eponymous debut or self-titled debut, just called Paul Simon. Probably my favorite Paul Simon album, a beautiful folksy album. Then just great album after great album. There Goes Rhymin' Simon, still crazy after all these years. But before he really captured that huge audience with Graceland, he had a real under the radar album called Hearts and Bones. I love this album. It's a little on the slickly produced side, but again, I think way, way overlooked. Song About the Moon, Train in the Distance, Late Great Johnny Ace, which is about the death of John Lennon. Just all fantastic. Every song on this album is great, except maybe the album opener, which is called Allergies. And I believe that was a single. And maybe that's why this album really didn't get the acclaim it deserved. It opened with a, in my opinion, kind of cheesy song, but woo. And the lyrics from Train in the Distance, negotiations and love songs are often mistaken for one and the same. Wow. Check out Hearts and Bones by Paul Simon. Okay, the Eagles. It's Hotel California, Hotel California, Hotel California. And yes, that is one of the great albums of all time. One of These Nights, also an album that gets a lot of acclaim from the Eagles. I think their second album, Desperado, is actually their best album. It's before Joe Walsh joined the band, that great Eagles lineup, just a kind of a Western theme, almost a concept album. Of course, it contains Tequila Sunrise and Desperado, two of their really well-known early songs. But it starts and ends with this Doolin Dalton, then into the Doolin Dalton Desperado kind of reprise at the end. Oh, it's just beautiful. It's just haunting. The whole album tells a story. Check out Desperado by the Eagles. Okay, Steely Dan. Very few bands have come out of the gate with an album as strong as their opener, Can't Buy a Thrill, and then on to Countdown to Ecstasy, Pretzel Logic. Then later, a little bit later on, before they called it quits, before they uncalled it quits, you've got Asia. I mean, wow, great albums. I think the album Katy Lied, which is kind of sandwiched in between all those, is incredibly overlooked. The band was pretty much Becker and Fagan at that point, so they started using great studio musicians. This album has Jeff Porcaro on drums, Larry Carlton on guitar for some of the tracks. The one track that Jeff doesn't play on, they've got the incredible Hal Blaine on drums, and the musicianship just never lets up. They say that Becker and Fagan were unhappy with the sound quality of this album because there was some kind of mistake or failure of their DBX noise reduction system, and they refused to listen to it or talk about it. Maybe that's why this album's a little bit underlooked, but geez, the songs, Bad Sneakers, Rose Darling, Your Gold Teeth 2, Dr. Wu with that incredible Phil Woods sax solo, and my favorite track, Chain Lightning, which features a beautiful, beautiful guitar work by Rick Derringer. Check out Katy Lied by Steely Dan. Okay, let's go to Chicago. Now, Chicago, unfortunately, got kind of a bad rep in their later years because they did turn into a sappy AOR band. I didn't love them either at that point, but geez, Chicago in their beginning stages, their first three albums, Chicago Transit Authority. The second one was just called Chicago. Now it's known as Chicago 2. Then Chicago 3. These were experimental jazz rock albums that just didn't let up. All three double albums, all three great. And then they maybe started morphing towards that lighter sound. I think their last great gasp is the album that is very underrated. That is Chicago 7. It was their first double album since Chicago 3. Yeah, it had I've Been Searching So Long, which is kind of their, warm, sappy, AOR radio friendly stuff. Great song though, but geez, so many other great songs. Call on Me, which was a single, the first song written by Lee Loughlin, their trumpet player. Biblos, which is a beautiful song by Terry Kath. Happy Man, a Peter Cetera song, absolutely beautiful. But this album was really commercially very risky. Side 1 and half of side 2 were totally instrumental. There's about, 27, 28 minutes before you even hear a vocal take. And these are jazz experimental songs. And then the guitar playing of Terry Kath. Speaking of underrated stuff, one of the most underrated guitarists in the history of rock and roll, in my opinion. Check out Chicago 7. It's broad, it's experimental, it has great beauty and depth. Really, really great album. Their last great one, in my opinion. Okay, let's move forward a bit to Oasis. Wow, Oasis. Again, they come out of the gate with Definitely Maybe, and then What's the Story, Morning Glory, two of the greatest British albums of all time. That Manchester sound, they just blast out of the speakers with no subtlety whatsoever. You cannot mistake the sound of Oasis. Then they got a little bloated and maybe overconfident with the Be Here Now, Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. Had some shakeups in the band. They add Jem Archer and Andy Bell after a few departures, and then come out with Heathen Chemistry. An album I think is still way overlooked, way overrated. Force of Nature, Stop Crying Your Heart Out, Songbird, Little by Little. This album just rocks, and it's quiet and mellow where it needs to be. Heathen Chemistry by Oasis. Okay, let's go back in time a little bit, but stay in England with Dire Straits. Wow, this is a band that deserves every bit of acclaim. On their fifth album, which was called Brothers in Arms, that's where they really, really achieved mass popularity, and deservedly so. That album's fabulous, but all their works before then were great as well. Obviously, the fantastic songwriting and guitar playing of Mark Knopfler really drove them, but the rhythm section's great too. And Dire Straits, after this huge success of Brothers in Arms, took a 6-year break before they came out with their final album, On Every Street. I think it never got the acclaim it deserves. I love every song on this album. It's a more subdued sound, but Calling Elvis, the title cut, The Bug, Heavy Fuel, all great stuff. Definitely check out On Every Street by Dire Straits. Okay, one of my favorite singer-songwriters is Jackson Browne. Just undoubtedly one of the all-time greats. Now, he again came out of the gate very strong with his Jackson Browne album, which is often called Saturate Before Using. But you look at it, the guy didn't quit. That first album, then For Every Man, Late for the Sky, which some people consider his best, The Pretender, the amazing live album called Running on Empty. He comes out with Holdout after that, after 5 critically acclaimed, fabulous albums, and it's got a slicker sound. He looks kind of, I don't know, on the cover, he looks a little un-Jackson Browne-y, wearing like an expensive looking blazer, and maybe just doesn't have that quiet, mellow, introspective songwriting that we all grew to know and love. And I think that really hurt him on this album, but the album's great. That Girl Could Sing is a fabulous song. Boulevard, Disco Apocalypse, horrible name for a first song on the album. And it's got a little bit of disco vibe to it, but it's really good. Yeah, the album's a little slick for Jackson. I'm going to highly suggest that you check it out. Okay, speaking of great singer-songwriters, Elvis Costello, wow, one of the best of all time. The guy's got so many albums, but again, when he comes out with just a punk new wave classic, My Aim Is True, gets even better with This Year's Model, and maybe even more popular with Armed Forces. Where does he go from there? Well, I'm going to mention 2 albums. We'll give him like a 1 and 1A for underrated albums. His 4th album, Get Happy, has a great soul feel to it. Really cool organ playing by Steve Naive. Amazing wordplay that we all have gotten used to, but even steps it up a notch for the Get Happy album. I think this album is sometimes lost in the shuffle. Maybe it's just too much to take in. 10 songs on each side. Wow. But the side closers of side 1 and side 2, High Fidelity and Riot Act are two of the most intense, insanely great Elvis Costello songs, all on the album Get Happy. So definitely check that one out. And then Almost Blue, an album of country covers by Elvis Costello. Oh, we didn't even know what to think when this album came out. It was like thinking the unthinkable, but it's not modern country. He goes back to Merle Haggard and George Jones and Charlie Rich. Again, the playing by Steve Naive on keyboards is fabulous. He adds John McVie on different stringed instruments, including, of course, pedal steel guitar for this country album. Check out Almost Blue by Elvis Costello. The only one on this list who gets a 1 and a 1A for underrated albums. Okay, now we are coming towards the end, moving into probably the greatest songwriter and the greatest band of all time. So we'll start with Bob Dylan. Yeah, pretty much the greatest songwriter of all time. Where do we even start with him? He's got 39 studio albums. Well, the album that I feel really deserves a listen that sometimes is overlooked is Street Legal. This album followed Blood on the Tracks and Desire, both universally acclaimed albums. He was almost in a where do we go from here situation, I think. So he changed his sound up a little bit. He ditches the harmonica for the most part and some of the violin from Desire that we were really growing on us, and adds the great Steve Douglas on sax. He's got some female backup singers. Woo, what an album. The sound quality is maybe a little thick or a little muddled, and that might be a turnoff, but woo, the songs, Changing of the Guards, Baby Stop Crying, No Time to Think, Where Are You Tonight? And then maybe one of the greatest Bob Dylan songs of all time, Senior. So definitely check out Street Legal by Bob Dylan. If you want to check out a few more overlooked Dylan albums, try New Morning, Slow Train Coming, Infidels, Oh Mercy, all fantastic. Okay, why not end with the Beatles? We all know the Beatles are one of the greatest bands of all time, and deservedly so. And if you were to say Revolver or Rubber Soul or Sgt. Pepper or The White Album or Abbey Road is the finest album of all time, I wouldn't argue with you. So wow, we've got this band that has 5 albums that you could easily argue as the greatest album of all time. And that kind of leaves Magical Mystery Tour alone in the mix of great Beatles albums that I think is very overlooked. It's a little bit of a confusing album. It's the soundtrack to the TV movie Magical Mystery Tour, which is a big flop. In England, it comes out as an EP, I believe a 6-song EP. And then in the US, in order to make it a full-fledged album, they add 5 singles to the other side. But geez, every song on this album is great. The title cut, Fool on the Hill, Blue Jay Way, Your Mother Should Know, all from the first side from the soundtrack. And then close it off with I Am the Walrus. How can you get better than that? Well, then flip the side too. We've got both songs from probably the greatest single of all time, the greatest A side single, double A side, Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever. Wow. Add to that Hello, Goodbye, Baby You're a Rich Man, All You Need Is Love. We've got Magical Mystery Tour. Can a Beatles album this great actually be overlooked? I'm going to say it can. So if that's kind of fallen off your radar, slipped through the cracks or whatever you want to call it, pull out Magical Mystery Tour, dust it off, play it, and enjoy. Well, there you have it. 15 or maybe 16 if you count the 2 from Elvis Costello albums by great artists that are overlooked and underrated. I hope you find time to check them out. I'm Richard Matter. This was For People Who Love Music, and that's you. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon. Thanks so much.